The first blow had come from behind, catching Astrid Nightshade between her shoulder blades with enough force to send her stumbling into the frozen mud. She'd barely caught herself on her hands before the second strike landed, a boot to her ribs that stole the breath from her lungs and left her gasping like a landed fish. "Stay down, traitor." The voice belonged to Marcus, her brother's most loyal enforcer, and it carried the kind of cold satisfaction that told her he'd been waiting for this moment, perhaps for years. "Makes this easier for everyone." Astrid stayed down, not because she was obedient, but because her body had stopped responding to her commands somewhere around the third beating. The frozen ground bit into her palms, and she could feel blood seeping through the thin fabric of her dress where yesterday's wounds had reopened. 7 weeks. She'd been carrying this secret for 7 weeks, and now, the baby. Protect the baby. The thought cut through the fog of pain with knife-sharp clarity. She curled inward, wrapping her arms around her middle even as Marcus's boot caught her hip and sent fresh agony radiating down her leg. Enough. Cain's voice, her brother's voice, once so familiar, now twisted into something she barely recognized. She heard his footsteps approaching through the mud, measured and unhurried, and forced herself to look up. He stood over her like a conquering general surveying fallen enemies, his dark hair slicked back from a face that shared her mother's cheekbones, and absolutely nothing of her mother's warmth. The beta insignia gleamed at his throat, their father's insignia, taken from a body not yet cold. "Sister." He said the word like it tasted of ash. "You've made this so much harder than it needed to be." "I haven't." Her voice cracked, throat raw from screaming denials that no one believed. "I never sold anything. I never betrayed anyone." "Cain, please. You know I didn't." "What I know," he interrupted, crouching down to her level with the slow deliberation of a predator savoring its kill, "is that the Council found coordinates to our southern outposts in your chambers. What I know is that 3 scouting parties were ambushed using information only you had access to. What I know," he gripped her chin, forcing her to meet his eyes, "is that you've been sneaking out at night to meet someone. Did you think I wouldn't notice?" "Theo." He means Theo. The name sent a spike of grief so sharp through her chest that for a moment she forgot the physical pain entirely. Theo, with his gentle hands and his secret smile, who'd promised to take her away from all of this. Theo, who'd stumbled into her chambers 3 days ago with his throat torn out, his body already cooling by the time she'd found him. Cain had killed him. She knew it with the same certainty she knew her own name, just as she knew he'd killed their father and framed her for the crimes he himself had committed. The coordinates, the betrayals, the human hunters who'd been picking off their patrol routes with impossible accuracy. All Cain, every last piece of it. "The evidence was planted," she whispered, even knowing it was useless. "You know it was planted because you put it there. Just like you put those hunters on our trail. Just like you put your claws in Father's—" His hand cracked across her face hard enough to make her ears ring. "Careful." The word was soft, almost tender, and infinitely more terrifying than his shouts. "You're already condemned. Don't make me add insanity to your list of crimes." He leaned closer, his breath hot against her ear. "I know about the baby, Astrid. Theo's little parting gift. Did you think you could hide something like that from me?" Her blood turned to ice. "If you cooperate," Cain continued, straightening up as if discussing the weather, "I might let you keep it, raise it in whatever hole I find to bury you in. But if you keep spreading these ridiculous accusations—" He smiled, and there was nothing human in it. "Well, accidents happen to pregnant women all the time." Something inside Astrid cracked. Not broke. She wasn't broken yet, but cracked. Like ice on a river just before spring. She'd been waiting for rescue, for someone to see the truth, for justice to somehow emerge from the ashes of everything she'd loved. Justice wasn't coming. No one was coming. If she stayed here, if she let them keep her, she and her baby would both die. Not quickly, not cleanly, but slowly, in whatever dark corner Cain deemed suitable for his disgraced sister. Get up. The voice in her head didn't sound like her own. It was fiercer, more primal. Her wolf, she realized, the part of her that had been beaten into silence over years of Cain's subtle cruelties, finally surging to the surface. Get up and run. She moved before she could second-guess herself. Her body screamed in protest as she rolled, her elbow catching Marcus in the knee and sending him staggering. Cain's shout of surprise bought her half a second, enough time to find her feet, enough time to locate the gap in the line of enforcers that surrounded them. She ran. The territory boundary was less than a mile north. She knew because she'd walked it 100 times as a child, memorizing the scent markers and the warning signs that separated Stoneheart lands from the vast wilderness of unclaimed territory beyond. If she could reach it, if she could cross into neutral ground. Branches tore at her arms. Her bare feet slipped on frozen leaves and hidden roots. Behind her, she heard Cain's roar of fury, heard the sounds of pursuit crashing through the underbrush, and she pushed harder. Her lungs burned, her wounds screamed. Blood soaked through her dress in hot, spreading patches that she couldn't afford to think about. Almost there, almost there, almost. The scent hit her like a wall. Pine and petrichor and something darker, something ancient, that made her wolf go completely still inside her chest. Not neutral ground. This wasn't unclaimed territory at all. This was Ravencrest. No. The thought came sluggish, clouded by pain and blood loss. No, the boundary was supposed to be. I must have drifted east. She was too deep to turn back now. The sounds of pursuit had faded somewhere behind her. Stopped at the border, her brother's enforcers knew better than to cross. Alpha King Zephyr Ravencrest was not known for his mercy toward trespassers. But she couldn't stop running, couldn't make her body understand that the danger had changed rather than disappeared. Her foot caught on a hidden root. The ground rushed up to meet her, and this time her arms were too weak to break her fall. She hit the frozen earth with a crack that might have been a branch, or might have been her ribs, and the world dissolved into fragments of sensation, cold mud against her cheek, the distant call of crows, the taste of blood in her mouth. The baby, she thought, and then, please. She wasn't sure who she was asking. God, maybe. The moon, the wild spirit of the territory itself, if such things existed. Please let my baby live, even if I don't, even if no one ever knows the truth. Please. The darkness took her before she could hear an answer. But somewhere, between one heartbeat and the next, she felt it. A presence drawing near. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, approaching through the trees. The scent of winter storms and absolute authority, wrapping around her like a shroud or perhaps a shield. And then, warmth. A hand on her shoulder, careful despite its size, turning her over with a gentleness that made no sense at all. Well, said a voice like thunder wrapped in velvet, deep and ancient and threaded with something that sounded almost like wonder. What do we have here? Astrid tried to open her eyes, tried to see the face that belonged to that voice. She managed a single glimpse, silver eyes and sharp cheekbones, dark hair and a mouth that looked like it had forgotten how to smile, before the darkness pulled her under completely. But in that glimpse, something impossible happened. Heat, sudden and shocking, bloomed in her chest like a brand pressed to bare skin. Her wolf, battered and bleeding and barely conscious, lifted her head toward the stranger and whispered a single word into the darkness of Astrid's mind. Mate. Astrid woke to silk against her skin, and the scent of winter storms filling her lungs. For a long moment, she couldn't place herself. The softness beneath her was wrong. Her bed in Stoneheart had been serviceable wool and packed straw, nothing like this whisper of fabric that seemed to flow around her like water. The air was wrong too, warm and clean, carrying notes of cedar smoke and something herbal she couldn't identify. And there was no pain. That last realization cut through the fog faster than anything else. She'd been running, bleeding, her body screaming with every step. She remembered falling, remembered the ground rushing up to meet her, remembered silver eyes, a voice like thunder wrapped in velvet. Mate. Her wolf stirred at the memory, pressing forward with an urgency that made Astrid's breath catch. She forced the creature back, forced herself to take stock of her situation with something approaching calm. Her wounds had been dressed. She could feel the careful wrapping of bandages around her ribs, could smell the poultice that had been applied to the worst of her injuries. Someone had changed her clothes, replacing her blood-soaked dress with a soft shift that left her arms bare. Someone had cared for her. The thought was so foreign that it took her several seconds to process. In the weeks since Cain had begun his campaign to destroy her, no one had shown her anything resembling tenderness. Even before that, kindness had been a rare currency in Stoneheart, doled out sparingly and always with strings attached. Slowly, carefully, Astrid opened her eyes. The room was large and dominated by windows that looked out over a forest still touched by morning mist. The furniture was dark wood, heavy and old, the kind of pieces that had been in a family for generations. Tapestries covered the walls, hunting scenes, she realized, wolves running beneath silver moons, and a fire crackled softly in a massive stone hearth. And there, in a chair by the window, sat the most dangerous man in 5 territories. Alpha King Zephyr Ravencrest was watching her. He was exactly as she remembered from that single glimpse before unconsciousness had claimed her. Silver eyes set in a face of sharp angles and harder planes, dark hair that fell just past his collar, a mouth that seemed carved from stone. He was large, even-seated, his shoulders broad enough to block out the pale morning light streaming through the window behind him. His hands rested on the arms of his chair, long-fingered and scarred, with the kind of stillness that spoke of absolute control. He looked like a statue. He looked like a king. He looked like the kind of man who could end her life with a single word and lose no sleep over it. Their eyes met. Heat erupted in Astrid's chest like wildfire catching dry timber, spreading outward until her entire body felt like it was burning from the inside. Her wolf didn't just stir this time. She surged, throwing herself against the walls of Astrid's control with desperate clawing need. The recognition was instantaneous and undeniable, a bone-deep certainty that bypassed her rational mind entirely and settled into her very cells. Mate, mate, ours, finally ours. Across the room she watched Zephyr's entire body go rigid, his pupils dilated, and then, impossibly, gold began to bleed through the silver of his irises, spreading outward like ink dropped in water. His hands tightened on the chair arms, and she heard the distinct crack of wood splintering under his grip. He inhaled sharply, and she knew that he was breathing her in, that her scent had just hit him the same way his had hit her. "No," she whispered, "because this couldn't be happening, because the universe couldn't be this cruel." She was pregnant with another man's child, branded a traitor by her own pack, beaten and broken and running for her life. She couldn't have a mate, couldn't have him, couldn't have this thing she'd stopped letting herself dream about years ago. Impossible, Zephyr breathed, and the word sounded like it had been dragged from somewhere deep in his chest. His voice was rougher than before, scraped raw by whatever was happening inside him. But even as he said it, even as denial shaped the word on his lips, his body was already moving. He rose from the chair with the fluid grace of a predator, and Astrid watched him approach with her heart hammering against her ribs. Each step brought him closer, and each step made the heat in her chest burn brighter. He stopped at the edge of the bed, close enough that she could see the gold in his eyes had completely overtaken the silver. Close enough that his scent wrapped around her like a physical thing, pine and storm clouds and something darker, something wild. Close enough that if she reached out, she could touch him. She didn't reach out. She couldn't move at all. "You're awake," he said, as if that weren't obvious. His voice had steadied somewhat, but there was a tension in his jaw that suggested he was holding himself in check through sheer force of will. "You've been unconscious for almost 2 days. My healers weren't certain you would survive." 2 days. She'd lost 2 days. "The baby," she heard herself say, her hand flying to her stomach before she could think better of it. "Is the baby—" Something shifted in Zephyr's expression. The predatory intensity didn't fade, but it was joined by something else, something that might have been understanding. "The child lives," he said quietly. "You nearly bled out twice, but the child lives. My healers are skilled, and you are stronger than you look." Relief hit her so hard that tears sprang to her eyes before she could stop them. Her baby was alive. After everything, the beatings, the running, the fall, her baby was still alive. The tears spilled over, and she turned her face away, mortified to be showing such weakness in front of an alpha king she'd never met. In front of her supposed mate, her mind supplied unhelpfully, and she shoved that thought down as deep as it would go. She heard him move, felt the bed dip slightly as no, not sitting. He'd crouched beside the bed, she realized, bringing himself down to her level rather than looming over her. "You have nothing to fear here." His voice was gentler now, though still carrying that undercurrent of barely leashed power. "Whatever brought you running through my territory in the middle of the night, whoever hurt you badly enough to leave you bleeding in my forest, they cannot reach you now. Do you understand?" Astrid forced herself to look at him again. He was so close. Close enough that she could see the faint lines at the corners of his eyes, the shadow of stubble along his jaw. Close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body, could hear the steady thunder of his heartbeat. Her wolf was practically purring, pressing against her skin with desperate longing. The mate bond pulsed between them, a living thing that seemed to demand acknowledgement. "You don't know what I've been accused of," she said instead of "thank you." "You don't know what you're protecting." "I know what my senses tell me," he replied evenly. "And they tell me that you're no traitor. Whatever lies were used to justify those wounds, they were exactly that. Lies." She stared at him. "You can't possibly know that?" "I know that I've been waiting 300 years for a mate." The words were simple, matter of fact, but they carried a weight that made her breath catch. "I know that the moon does not make mistakes. And I know—" His voice dropped lower, rough with an emotion she couldn't name, "that I will not frighten you in our first days together. Not when I've waited so long to find you." He rose then, stepping back from the bed with a control that seemed to cost him. She could see it in the tension of his shoulders, the way his hands curled into fists at his sides. "There's food on the table," he said, gesturing toward a tray she hadn't noticed before. "Eat. Rest. Heal. When you're ready to speak of what brought you here, I'll listen. But I won't push." He paused at the door, his hand on the frame. "I'll be just outside. If you need anything, water, food, more blankets, you have only to call. I won't enter unless you ask." And then he was gone, the door clicking softly shut behind him. Astrid stared at the closed door for a long moment, waiting for the catch, waiting for the other shoe to drop, for the trick to reveal itself, for the kindness to curdle into cruelty as it always did. But the room remained silent. The fire crackled gently, and through the solid wood of the door, she could hear the soft creak of someone settling against the wall outside. He was actually staying there, actually waiting. Heat pulsed in her chest where the mate bond had taken root, and she pressed her hand over her heart as if she could contain it. 3 days passed before Astrid felt strong enough to leave the bed for more than brief, shuffling trips to the bathing chamber. 3 days of careful meals left at her door, of healers who checked her wounds with gentle hands and left without asking questions, of absolute silence from the Alpha King who had apparently decided to station himself as her personal guard. She heard him moving sometimes, in the hall outside. Heard the low rumble of his voice as he spoke with whoever came to report to him. Heard him turn away visitor after visitor with the same quiet phrase, "The guest is not receiving anyone." On the third night, unable to sleep, Astrid finally rose and made her way to the door. She found Zephyr exactly where he'd promised to be, sitting with his back against the wall, his long legs stretched out before him, his head tilted back against the stone. His eyes were closed, but they opened the moment her hand touched the door handle. Gold bled through silver again, and she felt the answering pulse of heat in her chest. "You should be resting," he said, but there was no censure in the words. "I've done nothing but rest for 3 days." She leaned against the doorframe, suddenly exhausted despite her claim. "Why are you here?" "I told you I would be." "Yes, but—" She struggled to find words for the enormity of what he was doing. "You're an Alpha King. You have a territory to run, councils to attend, wolves to command. You can't just sit outside my door indefinitely." Something that might have been amusement flickered across his features, the first expression beyond intensity she'd seen from him. "I've been running this territory for 300 years, he said. "My wolves can manage without me for a few days. And my councils." His mouth curved slightly, that forgotten smile trying to remember itself. "They can wait." Astrid shook her head, not understanding. "Why? I'm nothing to you. A stranger who stumbled across your border. A pregnant woman carrying another man's child. A traitor, according to my own pack." The word still burned on her tongue. "You owe me nothing." Zephyr rose to his feet in one fluid motion, and suddenly he was close again, filling her space with his presence and his scent, and the inexorable pull of the bond. "You are my mate," he said simply, as if that explained everything. And perhaps to him, it did. "That makes you everything. It makes your child mine to protect, no matter who fathered it. It makes your enemies my enemies, your wounds my wounds, your safety my sacred charge." His hand rose, hovering near her cheek without quite touching. "I have waited centuries for you. A few days in a hallway is nothing." She should have pulled away, should have reminded him that she hadn't accepted the bond, that she barely knew him, that she was in no state to be anyone's mate. Instead, she heard herself ask, "Did you sleep there? On the floor?" The not quite smile returned. "I've slept in worse places." That wasn't an answer. "No," he agreed. "It wasn't." She stared at him for a long moment, this impossible man who claimed her as his mate, and then sat outside her door like a faithful guard dog, asking nothing, demanding nothing, simply waiting. "You could have come in," she heard herself say, "while I was unconscious, while I was sleeping. No one would have stopped you. No one would have blamed you." The gold in his eyes flared brighter. "You didn't invite me. I couldn't. I was unconscious. Then I would not enter." His voice was rough, almost harsh, and she realized with a start that he was angry, not at her, but at whatever she was implying. "I am not the kind of male who takes what isn't offered. I don't care what others would or wouldn't blame me for. You hadn't asked me to come inside. That was reason enough to stay out." Something cracked in Astrid's chest, that same fracture that had started when Cain's men beat her in the forest, spreading wider. She'd thought it was her breaking. Now she wondered if it was something else entirely. Something opening. "You're not what I expected," she whispered. His hand finally touched her cheek, his palm warm and rough against her skin. The contact sent a jolt through her entire body, her wolf pressing forward with urgent need. What did you expect? Someone who would take what he wanted. Someone who would use the mate bond against me. Someone... She swallowed hard. Someone like Cain. The name hung in the air between them. Zephyr's jaw tightened, and for a moment she saw something terrifying flash behind his eyes, a rage so vast and cold it made her shiver. Your brother, he said. It wasn't a question. How did you know? You called his name in your fever dreams, called it like a curse. His thumb traced her cheekbone with impossible gentleness, a strange contrast to the fury still burning in his gaze. Tell me what he did to you. When you're ready. Tell me everything and I swear to you. His voice dropped to something barely above a growl. He will never touch you again. She should have been afraid of that voice, that promise. Instead, she felt something loosen in her chest, something that had been clenched tight for weeks, maybe years. I'll tell you, she said softly, but not tonight. Tonight I just... She didn't finish the sentence, didn't know how to, but Zephyr nodded as if she'd said everything that mattered. Then tonight you rest. Tomorrow, or the day after, or whenever you're ready, I'll be here. He stepped back, giving her space, giving her room to breathe. And Astrid, who had trusted no one for as long as she could remember, felt the first fragile thread of something new take root in her chest. Not love, not yet, but the possibility of it, the beginning. The days that followed passed in a strange, fragile peace that Astrid couldn't quite trust. She kept waiting for the other shoe to drop, for Zephyr's patience to wear thin, for the demands to start. But each morning, she woke to fresh clothes laid across the chair by her bed, to breakfast waiting on a tray outside her door, to the lingering scent of pine and winter that told her he had checked on her before dawn. She began to explore the manor on the fourth day. Her legs were steadier now, her wounds healing faster than she had any right to expect. The healers credited Zephyr's blood. A small amount mixed with their medicines, they explained, his alpha essence accelerating her recovery. She wasn't sure how she felt about carrying pieces of him inside her, but she couldn't deny the results. The deepest gashes had closed to pink scars. Her ribs no longer screamed when she breathed. The manor itself was nothing like Stoneheart's cold stone corridors. Here, sunlight poured through enormous windows. Tapestries depicted hunts and celebrations rather than battles and conquests. Servants nodded to her with something that might have been respect, or at least curiosity, rather than the contempt she'd grown accustomed to in her brother's territory. She was studying one such tapestry, a moonlit gathering of wolves in a forest clearing, when she heard voices drifting from an open doorway ahead. Cannot seriously be considering this. A man's voice, sharp with barely concealed outrage. She's Stoneheart. She's pregnant with another male's child. She was branded a traitor by her own pack for Moon's sake. Astrid froze, her hand pressed flat against the stone wall beside her. And yet she is my mate. Zephyr's voice, quiet but edged with warning. Which makes her yours to protect, Counselor Aldrich, not question. Your Majesty, please. A woman's voice this time, attempting diplomacy. We don't doubt your judgment. But the alliance implications alone, Stoneheart will demand her return. Her brother Cain has already sent word requesting a diplomatic meeting. He claims she stole sensitive information before fleeing. Astrid's stomach lurched. Cain, already reaching for her, even here. Cain Stoneheart can rot in whatever hell will have him. Zephyr's tone could have frozen fire. His request was denied the moment his messenger crossed my border. Any further communications from Stoneheart territory will be treated as acts of aggression. Alpha King. The first man again, Aldrich. You are threatening war over a woman you met 5 days ago. A woman who may well be exactly what her brother claims. Have you considered that this mate bond might be? Choose your next words very carefully. The temperature in the hallway seemed to drop. Astrid pressed herself tighter against the wall, her heart hammering. If you are about to suggest that the bond itself might be fabricated, that I cannot recognize my own mate, then you are questioning not only my judgment, but my very nature. That is a challenge. Do you intend to issue one, Aldrich? Silence stretched, thick and suffocating. No, Your Majesty. The words came out strangled. I spoke out of turn. You did. See that it doesn't happen again. A rustle of movement, chairs scraping. The child she carries will be raised as my heir. Any member of this council who cannot accept that is welcome to leave my service. But hear me clearly. Question her honor again, and you question mine. I will not issue this warning twice. Astrid heard footsteps approaching and forced herself to move, slipping around a corner just as the council chamber doors swung fully open. She leaned against the wall, breathing hard, her hand pressed to her still flat belly. He had claimed her child, called it his heir. Before he knew the full truth, before he knew about Theo, before he knew about any of it, he had shielded her and her baby with his name, his crown, his protection. She thought of Cain's voice when he'd told her what would happen to the child. What he would do to ensure no bastard survived to complicate his plans. The casual cruelty of it, delivered with their mother's smile and their father's cold eyes. Zephyr was nothing like that. Nothing like any alpha she had ever known. And that terrified her more than Cain ever could. She told him about Theo that evening. They sat in a small solar overlooking the gardens, a fire crackling in the hearth despite the mild weather. Zephyr had asked nothing, simply invited her to join him for dinner and then sat in companionable silence as she picked at food she couldn't taste. His name was Theo, she said finally, and watched Zephyr's hands still on his wineglass. The father of my child. My brother murdered him 3 days before I fled. Zephyr set the glass down with deliberate care. I'm sorry. Don't be, She shook her head, frustrated with her own inability to find the right words. I cared for him. He was kind to me when kindness was rare. But I didn't love him. Not the way... She stopped herself, but not quickly enough. Not the way the bond makes you feel about me. Zephyr's voice was quiet, without accusation or triumph, simply stating a truth. I don't know what I feel about you. The words came out harsher than she intended. I don't trust feelings. I don't trust bonds. I watched Cain smile at our father every day for 20 years while plotting how to take his position. I watched him cry at the funeral for a man whose throat he had personally torn out. Zephyr leaned forward, elbows on his knees, silver eyes intent on her face. Then don't trust feelings. Don't trust the bond. Trust actions. Watch what I do. Watch what I don't do. A muscle in his jaw tightened. I know what Cain is. I've known for years. Suspected, at least. The pattern of attacks on my southern border. The precise intelligence the hunters seem to have about our patrol routes. Someone in Stoneheart was selling information. I never had proof. But it was Cain. The words poured out before she could stop them. He's been feeding coordinates to human hunting parties for almost a year. He used the money to buy loyalty from the enforcers, to position himself as the obvious choice for Beta when our father died. But then father started asking questions, getting suspicious. So Cain killed him and took the position before anyone could investigate. Zephyr's eyes burned gold at the edges. And then he needed to eliminate anyone who might have noticed, who might have seen things, who might talk. Theo saw a payment. Astrid's voice had gone hollow. He was supposed to be in the barracks, but he'd snuck out to meet me. He saw Cain taking gold from a human messenger. He told me. A week later, his throat was torn out in my chambers and I was being dragged before the pack as a traitor. Cain planted the evidence. Coordinates to the southern outposts. Information about patrol routes. Enough to damn me. She laughed bitterly. The irony is, I actually do know things. I know where he keeps his records, who he's paid off, which hunting parties he's worked with. But no one asked me. No one wanted the truth. Cain had already provided a more convenient story. Zephyr rose from his chair and crossed to kneel before her. The sight of it, this Alpha King, this man who had ruled for 3 centuries, on his knees before her, made something twist painfully in her chest. Then we will make them listen. His voice was a low growl, vibrating with barely contained fury. Every crime, every death, every piece of filth he buried, you will tell me all of it, and I will ensure the entire territory knows exactly who Cain Stoneheart really is. He'll come for me before that happens. The certainty of it settled like ice in her bones. He can't afford not to. I'm the only one still alive who can connect him to the hunters, to Father's death, to all of it. He'll come, and he'll... Zephyr's hand caught hers, warm and solid and steadying. Let him come. The gold had fully consumed the silver in his eyes now, his wolf rising close to the surface. Let him walk into my territory and try to touch what is mine. I have waited 300 years for you, Astrid. I did not wait that long to lose you to a coward who kills in shadows and hides behind forged evidence. She should have pulled away, should have reminded him, again, that she hadn't accepted the bond, that she still didn't know if she could. Instead, she turned her hand in his grip, lacing their fingers together. His skin against hers sent warmth flooding through her veins, her wolf pressing forward with a desperate wanting she couldn't entirely suppress. He won't fight fair, she whispered. He never does. Neither will I. Zephyr's thumb traced slow circles on the back of her hand. Not when it comes to you. The message arrived on the 7th day. Astrid was in the library, curled in a window seat with a book she wasn't really reading, when a servant appeared with a scroll bearing the Stoneheart seal. Her hands shook as she broke it open. Sister, it read, in Cain's elegant hand. I hope this finds you well. I understand there has been some confusion about the circumstances of your departure. I would hate for false accusations to damage the relationship between our territories. I propose we meet, neutral ground of course, to discuss your safe return home. Father would have wanted us to resolve this as family. I'm sure Alpha King Ravencrest is eager to maintain peace between our peoples. I'll await your response. Your loving brother, Cain. The words blurred as her vision went dark at the edges. She could hear his voice in every carefully crafted phrase, feel the threat coiled beneath the diplomacy. Your safe return home. As if home hadn't become a killing floor. As if safe wasn't a word that had lost all meaning the moment he'd had Theo murdered. Astrid! She jerked, the scroll crumpling in her fist. Zephyr stood in the doorway, his face carved from granite as he took in her expression. He wrote to you. It wasn't a question. She held out the ruined paper with a trembling hand. She watched him read it, watched the color drain from his knuckles as his grip tightened, watched the precise moment his control shattered. The scroll caught fire in his hands, actual flames, licking up from his palms as his wolf's power manifested in pure, protective fury. Neutral ground. He spat the words like venom as the paper crumbled to ash. He wants to get you alone, away from my territory, where his men can... I know. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. That's always been his way. The formal invitation, the reasonable request, and then the knife in the dark when you've been lured close enough. Zephyr crossed the room in 3 strides, pulling her up from the window seat and into his arms. She should have resisted, should have maintained the careful distance she'd been keeping, but the solidness of him, the fierce certainty of his protection, she needed it. Moon help her. She needed it. I won't let him take you. The words were a growl against her hair. I won't let him touch you or our child. I don't care what it costs. Our child. He said it so naturally, as if Theo's baby was already his, as if the claiming had already happened. And somewhere in the fragile, half-healed spaces of her heart, Astrid felt another wall begin to crumble. Zephyr. She pulled back just enough to look at his face, at the barely controlled rage and the desperate tenderness warring in his gold-shot eyes. I'm going to tell you everything, every detail, every piece of evidence I can remember, and then, she drew a shaky breath. Then we're going to destroy him. Together. His forehead dropped to rest against hers. Together. He echoed, the word a vow. Whatever comes. Together. And standing there in the golden afternoon light, wrapped in the arms of a man she was only beginning to trust, Astrid made a choice. She chose to stop running. She chose to stop hiding. She chose, for the first time in her life, to fight back. Whatever Cain threw at her next, she would be ready. Cain came 3 days later, just as Astrid had known he would. She was in the garden when the warning horns sounded, a space Zephyr had shown her on her 8th day at Ravencrest, filled with winter roses that somehow bloomed despite the frost. She'd been walking the stone paths, her hand resting on her still flat belly, thinking about the future she was only beginning to believe she might have. The first horn blast shattered that fragile piece like glass. Diplomatic envoy from Stoneheart, a guard called from the manor's rear entrance. They're demanding an audience with the Alpha King. Astrid's blood went cold. She knew, with the same bone-deep certainty that had warned her to run that night in the forest, that Cain hadn't come to negotiate. He'd come to finish what he'd started. She found Zephyr in the great hall, surrounded by his counselors and guards. His silver eyes found hers the moment she entered, and she watched concern flash across his features before he schooled them back to cold authority. He brought 20 men, Zephyr said quietly as she approached, armed as if for war, though he claims they're merely an honor guard. He's not here to talk. Astrid kept her voice steady despite the fear crawling up her spine. He's here to take me back, or kill me trying. Then he'll die trying. The gold was bleeding into Zephyr's irises again, his wolf pressing close to the surface. I'll turn him away at the gates. No. The word surprised her as much as it surprised him. If you turn him away without hearing him, he'll use it. He'll tell every pack in the territory that the Alpha King of Ravencrest is harboring a traitor, that you refused even the pretense of justice. He'll turn your allies against you. Zephyr's jaw tightened. I don't care what stories he tells. You should. Astrid stepped closer, lowering her voice so only he could hear. This isn't just about me anymore, it's about your territory, your people, the alliance networks that keep them safe. Cain knows exactly how to poison those relationships. Let him in. Let him speak. And then, let me answer. Understanding dawned in his eyes, followed immediately by resistance. You want to face him yourself. I want to end this myself. She held his gaze, refusing to look away. I spent weeks being his victim. I let him control every part of the narrative, shape every accusation, destroy every relationship I had. I will not let him do it again. Not here. Not with you. For a long moment, Zephyr said nothing. She could see the war playing out behind his eyes, his instinct to protect battling against his recognition of what she needed. Finally, he exhaled. If he makes a single move toward you, then you can tear out his throat. A ghost of a smile touched her lips. I won't stop you. Something that might have been pride flickered across his face. He turned to his guards. Escort the Stoneheart delegation to the garden courtyard. Ensure they surrender their weapons at the gate. His hand found the small of her back, warm and steadying. We'll hear what the ambassador has to say. The garden courtyard was where Ravencrest conducted formal diplomatic meetings, an enclosed space of stone and winter-bare hedges, overlooked by balconies where witnesses could observe. By the time Astrid arrived at Zephyr's side, those balconies were filled with counselors, guards, and servants. Whatever happened here would be seen by dozens. Cain stood at the courtyard's center, flanked by two of his enforcers. He'd dressed for the occasion in formal black, the beta insignia gleaming at his throat like a trophy. When his eyes found Astrid, his expression arranged itself into something approximating brotherly concern. "Sister." He spread his hands in a gesture of welcome that made her skin crawl. "Thank the moon you're safe. When you disappeared, I feared the worst." "Did you?" Astrid kept her voice flat. "Is that why you sent Marcus to beat me until my ribs cracked? Out of concern for my safety?" A flicker of irritation crossed Cain's face before he smoothed it away. "You were confused. Ill. The healer said the pregnancy had affected your mind, made you imagine things that never happened. I only wanted to bring you home for treatment." Treatment. The word tasted like poison. "Is that what you called it when you planted evidence in my chambers? When you framed me for selling information to the very hunters you'd been working with for almost a year?" Murmurs rippled through the watching crowd. Cain's smile didn't waver, but his eyes went cold. "These delusions again." He shook his head sadly. "Alpha King Ravencrest, I apologize. I'd hoped being away from the stress of home might have helped her condition, but clearly she needs professional care. If you'll just—" "I saw you take the gold." The words cut through his performance like a blade. For the first time, genuine surprise flickered across Cain's face. "Theo saw you receive payment from a human messenger 6 weeks ago," Astrid continued, her voice growing stronger. "He told me what he'd witnessed. And a week later, you murdered him in my chambers and used his body to condemn me." Lies. But Cain's composure was cracking now, anger bleeding through the diplomatic facade. The ravings of a broken mind. "You killed our father." Astrid stepped forward, away from Zephyr's protective presence, into the open space between them. "You tore out his throat because he'd started asking questions about the hunting parties, about why they always seemed to know exactly where our patrols would be. You took his beta insignia while his body was still warm, and you wore it to his funeral." Enough. Cain's voice had lost all pretense of gentleness. "I came here in good faith, seeking the return of my troubled sister, and instead I find myself accused of— I can prove it?" The words hung in the frozen air. Cain went very still. "Our mother was a seer." Astrid's heart was pounding now, but her voice stayed steady. "You always mocked that gift, called it useless parlor tricks, but I inherited it, Cain. I've been having visions since I was 12 years old. Fragments of truth that come when I need them most. I never told you, because I knew, even then, what you would do with that knowledge." "You're lying." But there was fear in his eyes now, real fear, and it fed something fierce and hungry in her chest. "Am I?" She drew a breath, reaching for the power that had always been there, sleeping in her blood like embers waiting for wind. "Let's find out." The gift had always come to her unbidden, flashes of memory, glimpses of truth, fragments that made sense only in hindsight. But as Astrid reached for it now, deliberately, consciously, she felt it respond like a living thing. Heat flooded her veins, different from the warmth of the mate bond. Older, wilder, carrying the weight of generations of women who had seen what others refused to acknowledge. She didn't try to control it. She simply opened herself to it and let it pour through her like lightning through a copper wire. Light exploded across the garden. Not physical light. Something deeper. Something that bypassed the eyes and struck directly at the mind. She felt it tear through her, felt it reach out to touch every consciousness in the courtyard. And then she was no longer standing in Ravencrest's garden. She was in her father's study, watching through Cain's eyes as he smiled and nodded at their father's concerns, watching as he slipped poison into the evening wine, watching as the old Alpha's eyes went wide with betrayal in the moments before Cain's claws found his throat. She was in the forest, watching Kane pass a leather pouch to a human with cold eyes, pointing to a map marked with patrol routes. Watching the human smile and say, "Pleasure doing business." She was in her own chambers, watching Kane drag Theo's body across the floor, arrange the evidence, wipe his bloody hands on a cloth he would later plant in her belongings. Every crime, every betrayal, every murder. She showed them all. When the visions finally released her, Astrid staggered. Strong arms caught her from behind. Zephyr, she realized, his presence a solid anchor as the world spun back into focus. The courtyard had erupted into chaos. Kane's enforcers were backing away from their master, horror written on their faces. The counselors on the balconies were shouting over each other, and somewhere, someone was being sick. But Astrid only had eyes for Kane. Her brother had fallen to his knees, clutching his head, where the visions had ripped through his carefully constructed lies. When he looked up at her, there was nothing left of the charming diplomat. Only the monster she'd always known lurked beneath. "You were supposed to be weak." The words came out in a snarl as Zephyr's guard seized his arms, dragging him upright. "You were supposed to die quietly in some forgotten corner. You were supposed to be nothing, just like Mother always said you'd be nothing." Astrid walked toward him, each step steadier than the last. The power was still humming in her blood, still filling her with a strength she'd never known she possessed. "I was supposed to be your victim." She stopped an arm's length away, close enough to see the madness in his eyes, the rage of a predator denied its prey. "I chose to be your end instead." Kane lunged. Even bound by guards, even stripped of his weapons, he was still strong, still fast, still driven by a lifetime of believing himself untouchable. His teeth went for her throat, his claws raking toward her belly. He never reached her. Zephyr moved like the storm his name promised. One moment he was behind her, the next he was between them, and his claws were buried in Kane's chest. The guards released their grip, stumbling back, as the Alpha King lifted her brother off the ground like he weighed nothing at all. "You threatened my mate." Zephyr's voice had dropped to something barely human, a growl that resonated in Astrid's bones. "You tried to murder the child she carries. You have hunted her, hurt her, and haunted her for weeks." "She's a traitor," Kane gasped, blood bubbling at his lips. "She's nothing but a—" Zephyr's other hand closed around his throat. "She is my Luna." Each word fell like a hammer blow. "She is my queen. She is everything you will never live to threaten again." His claws tore through Kane's throat in one clean motion. Astrid watched her brother die without looking away. She watched the light leave his eyes, watched his body crumple to the frozen ground, watched the blood spread across the white stone like a final confession. She waited for guilt, for grief, for some kind of horror at witnessing the death of her own kin. Instead, she felt only peace. It was over. Finally, completely, irrevocably over. Zephyr turned to her, his hands still wet with Kane's blood, his eyes still burning gold. She should have been frightened of him in that moment. This ancient predator, this king who killed without hesitation, this male whose power dwarfed anything she'd ever known. Instead, she stepped forward and wrapped her arms around him. "Thank you," she whispered against his chest. His arms came around her, holding her with a tenderness that contradicted everything about the violence still fresh on his hands. "I would burn the world for you," he said roughly. "I would tear down every kingdom that threatened you. Never thank me for protecting what is mine." The crowd was still watching. The counselors were still processing what they'd witnessed. But in that moment, wrapped in the arms of her mate, Astrid couldn't bring herself to care about any of it. She was safe. Her child was safe. And the man holding her had just proven, beyond any possible doubt, exactly what he was willing to do for them both. That night, after the chaos had settled and Kane's body had been burned to ash, Astrid found herself standing in Zephyr's chambers. She had come to him. That felt important. that she had walked through his door of her own volition, that she had chosen to be here rather than waiting for him to come to her. The choice was hers, and she made it with clear eyes and a steady heart. He was standing by the window when she entered, still dressed in the formal clothes he'd worn for the confrontation, though he'd washed Kane's blood from his hands. When he turned to face her, the question in his eyes was clear. "You don't have to be here." His voice was careful, controlled. "What happened today? You need time to process it. I can wait. I told you I would wait, and I meant." Astrid crossed the room and kissed him. She felt his shock in the way he went rigid beneath her touch. Then his hands were in her hair, on her waist, pulling her closer with a desperation that stole her breath. He kissed her like a man who had been starving for 300 years and had finally found sustenance. When they finally broke apart, both of them gasping, his eyes were pure gold. Astrid. Her name sounded like a prayer on his lips. "Are you certain? The bond, the marking? Once it's done, it cannot be undone. I need you to be absolutely—" "I'm certain." She cupped his face in her hands, forcing him to meet her gaze. "I spent weeks being afraid. I spent months before that being controlled, being manipulated, being made to feel like I didn't deserve to choose my own fate. And then I met you." Her thumb traced the sharp line of his cheekbone. "You gave me choices when everyone else tried to take them away. You protected me without suffocating me. You let me face Kane on my own terms, even when every instinct must have been screaming at you to keep me hidden and safe." A tremor ran through him. "I wanted to lock you away somewhere he could never find you." "I know." She smiled, small and true. "But you didn't. You trusted me to be strong enough. You trusted me to fight my own battles." She rose on her toes to press her forehead against his. "How could I not want a mate who sees me that clearly?" His control shattered. He lifted her like she weighed nothing, carrying her to the bed with steps that were more prowl than walk. When he laid her down against the silken sheets, his body covering hers, she felt the trembling in his muscles, not from fear or hesitation, but from the effort of holding himself back. "Tell me if you want me to stop." The words came out rough, strained. "At any point, for any reason, tell me and I will." "I don't want you to stop." She arched up against him, her hands fisting in his shirt. "I want you to claim me, Zephyr. I want to be yours." The sound that tore from his throat wasn't quite human. He kissed her again, deeper this time, his hands mapping the curves of her body through her dress. She felt the heat building between them, the mate bond singing in her blood like a symphony finally reaching its crescendo. When he pulled back to look at her, there was so much reverence in his gaze that it made her eyes sting. "My mate." He breathed the words like a benediction. "My queen, my Astrid." His mouth found the junction of her neck and shoulder, the claiming spot, the place where his mark would bind them for eternity. She felt his breath warm against her skin, felt the scrape of his teeth as he positioned himself. "Yours," she whispered. "I'm yours." His teeth sank into her flesh. Pain, sharp and bright, flared through her nervous system. But even as she gasped, the sensation began to shift. The pain melting into something else, something that spread through her veins like liquid fire. She felt the bond snap into place, felt his presence flood her consciousness, felt everything he was pour into her through that single point of connection. Love, she felt, devotion, centuries of loneliness finally ending. Joy so fierce it brought tears to immortal eyes, and underneath it all, a single word repeated like a heartbeat. Mine, mine, mine. When he finally released her, licking the wound closed with gentle care, Astrid was trembling with the force of what had passed between them. But she wasn't finished. "My turn," she breathed. She felt his surprise through the bond, bright and wondering, as she pushed at his shoulder until he rolled onto his back. She straddled him, looking down at this ancient king who had waited 300 years for her, and something fierce and possessive rose up in her chest. Her wolf pressed forward, stronger than she'd ever felt it, and when she lowered her mouth to his shoulder, she felt her teeth sharpen with borrowed power. She bit down. His back arched off the bed, a sound tearing from his throat that was half growl and half moan. She tasted copper on her tongue, felt his blood mixing with her saliva, felt the bond between them strengthen and deepen and complete itself. Through their connection, she felt what he was feeling, the overwhelming rightness of being claimed, the surrender of the last walls around his ancient heart. Yours, came his thought, clear as a bell. I have always been yours, since before I knew you existed, since before your grandmother's grandmother drew her first breath. She released him, licking his wound closed as he had done for her, and when she raised her head to look at him, his eyes were wet. Mine, she said, and the word carried the weight of forever. Yours, he answered. Mate. They held each other as the bond settled into its final form. No longer a potential, no longer a possibility, but a living connection that would last until death and perhaps beyond. She could feel him in her chest now, a warm presence that pulsed with his heartbeat. She could feel his emotions like distant weather, the fierce joy, the protective devotion, the love so deep it had been waiting for her across centuries. I can feel you, she whispered against his chest, and you. His arms tightened around her. You have no idea how long I've waited to feel anything other than alone. She tilted her head up to look at him, her mate, her king, the father her child would know. You'll never be alone again. His smile, when it came, was like watching the sun rise over snow-covered mountains. The coronation took place on the full moon, 3 weeks after Cain's death. Astrid stood at the top of the great hall's dais, wearing a gown of deep blue that matched the Ravencrest colors, her hair woven with silver threads that caught the candlelight. At her throat, the Luna's collar gleamed, an ancient piece of Ravencrest jewelry that Zephyr had placed there himself, whispering words of devotion against her skin as he fastened the clasp. Below her, the hall was filled with wolves from both territories. Ravencrest's people had come to honor their new Luna, and from Stoneheart, those who remained after Cain's enforcers had been stripped of their positions had come to pledge their loyalty to the woman who had freed them from a tyrant's rule. I present to you, Zephyr's voice rang out across the hall, Astrid Nightshade Ravencrest, Luna of the Ravencrest Pack, Queen of the Northern Territories, and my eternal mate. The howls that rose up shook the rafters. Astrid looked out at the sea of faces, some familiar, some strange, all united in their celebration, and felt tears prick at her eyes. 6 weeks ago, she had been running for her life through a frozen forest, certain that she and her child would die before dawn. Now she stood as queen, marked and claimed and loved beyond anything she'd ever imagined possible. Her hand drifted to her belly, still flat, but no longer alone. The child growing there would never know Cain's cruelty, would never know the fear that had defined Astrid's youth. Instead, this child would know the fierce protection of a father who had chosen them both before they were even born. Zephyr's hand covered hers, warm and solid and sure. Our child, he said through the bond, our family, our forever, she answered. And when the celebrating finally died down, when they stood alone on the balcony overlooking the moonlit territory that was now their shared domain, Astrid leaned into her mate's embrace and let the peace wash over her. The war was over. The monster was dead. And ahead of her stretched a future brighter than anything she'd ever dared to dream. I love you, she said, the first time she'd spoken the words aloud. Zephyr pulled her closer, pressing a kiss to the mark on her shoulder that proclaimed her his for all eternity. And I love you, until the last star falls from the sky, until the moon forgets how to rise, until forever ends and begins again. Astrid smiled, tucking herself against his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat through their bond. She had run from death and found life. She had fled from hatred and discovered love. She had lost everything and gained more than she ever knew existed. And in the arms of her mate, beneath the blessing of the full moon, she finally, completely, allowed herself to believe in happily ever after.